Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership three-part series on development plans. This is part one. I'll start with the importance of having a development plan and why it's even more important for small businesses. And I'm talking about up to about 400 employees just for this conversation. Or partners, associates, right? I understand there's virtual teams out there, but if you're thinking about up to about 400, and there's reasons for that I'll get into at another time. You may be surprised by what I share. You're probably familiar with the elements, but when seen together, it's a compelling eye-opener that can't really be unseen. Now, imagine you're running a sports team in a high-stakes season, the kind where the difference between winning and losing isn't just a score, it's survival. Every week, you face a challenging opponent. You tweak the plays, adapt strategies, and train your players to respond to whatever happens on the field because you know plans seldom survive contact with reality. The scenario is not that different from small business leadership, whether we admit it or not. Big companies have the luxury of depth. If one player is having a bad day, there's a whole bench to draw from. Processes have redundancies, and entire departments can absorb mistakes without skipping a beat. That they can get away without having a comprehensive development plan. People learn from those around them, and they go through standardized training, generic leadership training. They go to this seminar and that conference. The same way hunter-gatherer ancestors learned from the behavior of the tribe, they learn by being exposed and watching experience, right? Small businesses, not so much. Instead of redundancy, because multiple people know the process, you have one person responsible for several critical processes. One person's off day can ripple through the entire workflow. A missed detail can mean completely missing an opportunity window. A single customer service slip triggers negative reviews. But here's the thing. That vulnerability is also your advantage. If you know how to develop your people, not as a by default plan, but with an intentional methodology, as though you were developing a high performance team. You see, big company leadership advice isn't often designed for environments where safety nets, big company leadership is often designed for environments where safety nets already exist. It's built for stability and speed. In a small business, speed and adaptability are the safety nets. That's why the most relevant leadership models for us aren't coming from Fortune 500 management books. They're coming from winning sports teams, head-to-head competition disciplines like jiu-jitsu and martial arts schools. And these are also consistent with how military special operations units function. In special ops training, soldiers are operational within months, not years, in some cases weeks. For example, jumping out of airplanes, including jets in a night jump. It's a 3-week course and hasn't changed much since I attended almost 50 years ago. The training is standardized based on best practices, and while this was not known when it was designed nearly a century ago, the methodology was based on how our 200,000-year-old brain learns and performs. The same is true for the ancient arts. They didn't have scanning tools to understand the nervous system, but through trial and error, they landed on what works, and those principles are still in use today across all these disciplines because they work and because the 200,000-year-old brain hasn't changed. That's the mindset we need for business development. If the Army can train a special ops soldier to function effectively as part of a precision unit, and they can do this in weeks and months, excuse me, if they can do this in weeks and months, what can you accomplish in 6 months? Small business leadership development must be deliberate. We know exactly what we're training for and include some validation. Standardized, so everyone knows the plays and can execute without hesitation. Progressive, Each stage builds on the last, increasing complexity and capability, but also reinforcing what has already been learned. Now, you may think leaders don't want training and development. While that may be true, we know they want autonomy, competence, and being part of something important. So as the owner or senior leader, you leverage what they want to get them what they need. Imagine this. Every person on your team has a clear path to becoming a top performer in their role. Skills are introduced, tested, reinforced, and expanded. Weaknesses get addressed before they become costly. And when an opportunity or crisis appears, your team doesn't just react, they execute. It's worth the effort. In the next two parts, I'll connect this with neuroscience and provide an example that you can use as a template to start installing this methodology into your organization or your team. Now, there's a big difference between the basketball team examples in your organization. No one is actively trying to stop your every play. Think about that. If a sports team can do it with an opponent in their face every second, what can you do with a clear field ahead of you? Small businesses aren't at a disadvantage. You can train faster, adapt faster, and win faster than companies 10 times your size. It takes a playbook, and it takes leaders and team members who know how to execute the plays, even on a bad day of a bad week. Now I'll wrap up with some examples so that we can start to make this practical. It's an easy thing to say. Now, using my examples of martial arts, sports teams, and special ops are different. Those are all physical. Business is mental. That's an easy thing for people to say, right? It doesn't apply to business. This is mental. I tell them what they do and they do it. Not so fast. Each of those disciplines I mentioned rely on both cognitive and physical skills. They're based on nervous system memory. Most people are comfortable talking about muscle memory, but here's the thing, it's not muscle memory at all. Muscles do adapt, but they do so with strength and endurance. The timing, precision, fast or slow twitch, that's nervous system memory. So it's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. Now, when you say that 95% of a person's actions are habitual, where do you think those habits reside? Again, nervous system memory. As associations, they are literally stored in the network of neurons with the synapses, myelinated neurons, etc. Now, the brain and nervous system can process information around 11 million bits per second. Now, when you want to change behavior, that's what's at play. Change the behavior, you change the outcome. When you start approaching cognitive development the same way you approach physical activity development, you'll begin to see breakthroughs, and you'll see them fast. You'll no longer think people can't change. They can, but they have to want it. And as the owner or senior leader, you provide the context and the roadmap. You get them what they need by giving them what they want. Let's take a look at a few examples of how internalizing a cognitive skill can change the outcomes of a business. I'm talking about leaders, but it applies to frontline people. As much as I'm going to be talking about leaders, you could think about what's the capability to do some rapid testing, to build landing pages, to have quality video done. I know you can use AI, but you also probably know that there's benefits of using real people. Now, there's hundreds of principles, models, and frameworks, but you only need a handful that work in your organization to make major differences. Now, one example I like to use, it's been around since the 1960s. You don't hear much about it, but it works especially well when working with artificial intelligence, and that's MECE. M-E-C-E. Mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. Now, this is a consulting model, but see, one of the things that's happening now, as organizations flatten and they're using more and more artificial intelligence, a lot of the frameworks and models that were pretty much in the domain of consultants need to be used at the front line. There's another thing that's going on. If you just go back a couple of decades, change was very slow. Even after the internet in the 90s and .com, that era, they were much faster than before, but nothing like what we're seeing today. The speed that things are coming and changing. We have to have these skills at the front line. As leaders and decision makers, you have to have models and frameworks to keep you from getting triggered. Now let me just take a look at this MECE model. So what you have, again, mutually exclusive, collectively exhausted. And it's very helpful because when you get into discussions, you're designing something, and oftentimes we're designing into the field of infinite possibilities. And we're having to do research on the fly. There's a lot of unknowns. There's unknown unknowns, and there's known unknowns, et cetera, right? So we have to be able to keep things framed in such a way so that we're making progress and not spinning our wheels or just repeating the same conversations. So what you have here in this example, this is idea 1 and idea 2. These are not exclusive, right? Because there's overlap. To be exclusive, they would be separate. And so you're not going to use MECE on every single thing, but certainly when you're interacting with artificial intelligence, especially when it gets into this mode of like wanting to help you and give you this and give you that, and it's throwing suggestions at you, and next thing you know, you're working for it, and it feels like, right? So by using a MECE model, you can continue building your prompts in such a way, and you can even tell AI that you're building a MECE understanding of this, so you need to you want it to help you do that. Now you can explore a complete idea, you can start separating them, and you can get this kind of a view. Now, I'm not saying AI is the end all be all. I think you want human intelligence, because especially when you're in the field of infinite possibilities, AI doesn't really know what's out there in that field of infinite possibility, and it also doesn't really know what your vision is, what your strengths are. You may tell it, but it doesn't know it like you do. And it certainly doesn't know it like your collective senior team understands it. Now here's the other one, collectively exhaustive. So this is not collectively exhaustive, right? This is not exhaustive because you have idea 1 and idea 2, but you can see when it's exhaustive, all of the blocks are filled up. So mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, it's just MECE. Now, that took me, less than 3 minutes to explain. You can do some searches on it, you can read about it, try it out a few times, own it, teach it, and within a few hours, you can own this framework. And if everyone on your team owned the framework and you had the common language, do you see how that can help you with the next crisis that's coming up, or taking advantage of the next big opportunity? This is what I'm talking about. Now, you may hear me talking about this and you may be thinking about it consciously, but when I talk about development plans, we're taking this and moving it into nervous system memory the same way you would take a physical skill and move it into what we think of as muscle memory, but as I've already said, is really nervous system memory. Another example, I like using decision frameworks, and this one came from Ben Sands. I started collecting infographics on LinkedIn because, it's like motherhood and apple pie. You can't disagree with them, but there's so many that are coming constantly. It's like, how does one person know and understand everything that's in these different infographics? You can't. And so I started collecting them. I'm going to do a piece on it because you don't need all of them. You just need a few. Now, on this one, for example, let's move this out of the way. So what we have here, I'm going to try to blow this up a little bit. Yeah, so thinking hats. This is an interesting one. Use it when you need a rounded view from multiple angles. How it works. Each hat represents a way of thinking. So one person is a white hat, the facts and data. A red hat, emotions and gut feelings. Black is risks and caution. Yellow, optimism and benefits. Green, creativity and alternatives. Blue, organization and process. And then you rotate through the different hats and analyze your decisions from every perspective. Again, this is something that you can own across your senior leadership team. Now, these are multiple decision models. You may have heard of SWOT. There's also the reverse TOWS, where you look at threats and opportunities first, and then you work through the SWOT, but you do it backwards because you're starting with the external view, not the internal. I like the 5 whys. This has been around. I remember hearing about this back in the big quality days, total quality management. But you don't need all of the frameworks on this page. You just need one. You need the one that works for you that you're going to use, and then you turn it into a habit. And that's what I mean by the development plans. In the development plans, you're using the same kind of methodologies that are used in, say, martial arts, where people are having to demonstrate it and they're having to use it under pressure. Like in the Army, I remember having in Ranger training, we had to put our weapons together in the dark or blindfolded, right, to simulate doing it in the dark. We spent a lot of time at night. That's when we moved, right? We were doing patrols. We spent a lot of time at night, and you had to do these things in the dark as a skill. And once you could do it in the dark, you can certainly do it in the daytime, but it's about demonstrating it. It's about observing it. It's about validating it and then correcting it and then building on it. So each time you build on it, you're reinforcing it. You're not just training something today and then you never touch it again. We're continuing to build on it. So for example, if I was using this framework as something that we did, then we would come back to the framework as we're developing our project plan, as we're describing scope. We would come back to that and have debates about scope using that HATS model. Or maybe you're doing it with something else, with one of the other decision-making models. Another one I like to use, and this has served well over the years, and that is the 2-axis framework. You can have profit and growth. It's a common one. And too often, if you just pay attention to the things that are coming across your feed, you will see that there's a bias towards growth. There's a bias towards revenue. Everyone wants to tell you how they could make you more money, but without looking at profit, you end up in a situation where your profit, maybe from a dollar standpoint, is growing, but from a percentage standpoint, it's shrinking. And that's a dangerous place to be. I like to ask people for a low-cost solution, a no-cost solution, and an ideal solution. That's pushing the envelope. Again, that's a skill. That can be a thinking skill. Now, I said it, and you heard it, and you can apply it as, yeah, I like that. But to turn it into a habit, you have to apply neuroplasticity. The brain can adapt, and we can help it adapt. And neuroplasticity is what that's about, changing habits. Now, without the knowledge of neuroplasticity, habit formation was more difficult. We had this, 7 steps in 90 days and 120 days and 21 days, so many different viewpoints. And the reason is because there's 2 major parts that go with habit change. And I'll get into more of this next week, but it's the myelin on the neurons and it's the synaptogenesis, which activates neural pathways that are in play, and then it deactivates them. The myelin stays, so the habit core of the habit stays, and when the central nervous system senses that this thing is important, it will activate those neural pathways. Very common, like if you have any seasonal sports, whether it's hiking or skiing or something like that, you may notice you feel a little awkward the first time out for the season, the first day or 2 for the season, but very quickly it comes on. That's not the muscle adaptation as much as it is the nervous system adaptation. We'll get into more of that next week because it is an important topic. And then the last one I want to talk about today is something that I think it's going to be a cognitive skill, and it's something that I think is essential for building a high-performing team, because in order to have a successful development plan, the same way that the Army or the military or martial arts, the same way that they break people down so that they can build them up, we can't do that in the business world. We can't just go around breaking people down. But what we can do is use what I have developed as the 7-step model. The 7-step model is a way that, without breaking somebody down and then building them back up, we can get to a place where we are effectively working from not a blank slate like they would after being broken down, but you have almost the same advantages of a blank slate. So what we have is you've heard of stimulus response. And whether it's Pavlov's dogs or Skinner, whatever model you've had, the stimulus response, and it's there and you don't worry about it. You may know that this thing can happen in a half a second. I'll call it 500 milliseconds. But this is actually our opportunity, because this lives in the network of neurons, and as I mentioned earlier, it can process 11 million bits per second. And that's because the network of neurons, you have the myelin, the synaptogenesis, but you have the impulses going through them are basically energy, and that energy is very much like thought, which is why people think that they're thinking. There's the impulses from the nervous system, and then there's real thinking, and they're different, and it helps to learn the difference, and that's part of this process here. So I'll speak about this more, but I'm going to give you a high-level view. So the 7-step process, we first have pre-stimulus. This is important because in a day, we have about 33,000 decisions that we make each day. If you're making 33,000 decisions a day and you assume that you're awake somewhere around 65,000 seconds, that means you're making a new decision every other second, which tells you that you're probably not making real conscious decisions. These are stimulus response cycles. These are habits. This is where you get the 95% of our actions are habitual. So what's interesting is if you watch people, how they teach or train or develop or get things done, even though they may know this, 95% is by habit, even though they may have said it hundreds of times, when they interact with somebody, they interact with them as though if I tell them, then they'll do it. I tell them, they'll do it. And then they don't understand why the people are not performing. They're not performing because, as you already know, 95% is by habit. You told them something in the 5%, that 5% gets overwhelmed very quickly, and if it doesn't become a habit, it's not going to be remembered. And even if they know it, even if they can spout it back to you, and we hear this all the time, people know all the right answers, they know all the right things to say, but they don't do them. I like to say to know and not do is not much better than not knowing. Actually, I say to know and not do is to not know, because I want to emphasize the fact that you have to actually do it to get it into the nervous system. You can teach somebody how to swim on the side of the pool, and they can go through all the movements, but until they jump in the water and do it, you can't sign off that they know how to swim. So we're taking the knowledge and we're going to have assessments and validations to make sure it can be done. So this is why the pre-stimulus is so important, because you have this thing called priming, and we're constantly being primed. And if you look at artificial intelligence and you do sales copy, it knows how to sequence the building blocks of sales copy to drive compliance. It may not be the best, it may not be as good as a human is doing it, but my point is you can generate hundreds of landing pages. An organization, a company can generate hundreds of landing pages in a very short period of time. We're constantly being bombarded. You think it was bad 5 years ago. You wait till 5 years from now. The amount of data that we're going to be bombarded with. It's a few years ago it was like 5,000 bits or 5,000 ad stimuli per day. I just saw something where it's closer to 10,000 ad stimuli per day. I guess that could maybe go into some of those 33,000 decisions. So the point is, we have to understand the pre-stimulus because it's setting up the next stimulus response, and that stimulus response is setting up the next one, and that one is setting up the next one. So what we have here is we have, in the pre-stimulus phase, you have beliefs, we have neuroplasticity, which is the process of forming habits, replacing habits, strengthening habits, etc. I put all that into neuroplasticity. We have priming, and we have mindset. And I'm also going to add physiology. Now, all of these, what's interesting, all of these can impact the other one. Every single one of these 5 can impact the other one. So we have to understand how we go in this circle and we get stronger and stronger, bringing the physiology along. And sometimes you have to use physiology to get to the neuroplasticity, or you may have to use physiology to get to the priming. Mental heuristics is a great example. We can be primed into falling down this path of cognitive biases, but you can use physiology to change your posture, to change what you're focusing on, and so it minimizes the power that cognitive bias potentially has over you. So that's the pre-stimulus, and this would be step 1. Then we have our state. Now, if you think about priming, and we've all been there, right? We have a situation where we're having a good day, and then something happens, and I like to call it a serotonin takes a hit, right? Because serotonin is, we think of it as the feel-good neurotransmitter, but I like to think of it as the one-upmanship neurotransmitter. So yeah, if you take a hit, now you feel like you've been one-upped, and that serotonin takes a hit. You have to get back up so you have your full power, your full energy behind you. If you stay in that, you can spiral down, and we've experienced this. Then you have dopamine, etc. The willpower, decision fatigue, I won't power, all of that comes into play. And managing that state, we'll call that step 2. And there's ways to do it. Again, we can use physiology to drive your state. We can change beliefs to drive the state. We can use priming to change our state. We can use mindset to change our state. We can use habits to change our state. But we have to do something to maintain our state. And I have 3 lines there. You have a physical state of being, you have a mental state of being, and you have a energy state of being. So I could say mind, body, spirit, but let's just call it an energy state of being. So you can have, your mental could be positive, but your energy could be low. So we have a low positive. Or you could have a negative mental, and you could have a low energy. Now you got low negative, or you can have negative mental and high energy, and that's bad because now you have outbursts and you have people being triggered and all that, and then you have the physiology. You can look at a sports team, and sometimes you can see the moment when they collectively decided that they don't have a chance. On the other hand, you can look at a sports team and you can, on the sidelines, and you can see when they collectively decided that they could win this thing even though they're behind. And that physiology changes, and it counts for something. Then we have the stimulus response, what is known as the stimulus response cycle, and this is steps 3 to 7. But to make it work, it's not just a stimulus response cycle. It's a stimulus reaction, we'll call it R1. So that's your step 3. Then we have your response, R2. That's your step 4. Then we have your emotions, which may need emotion modulation so that you don't get triggered or stay triggered, so that we come back quickly. You go from a fixed mindset back to a growth mindset. That's step 5. And by the way, so every one of these, we talk about how to have command over it, how to command this, how to command this, and how to command each one of these. And because this part here happens so quickly, from stimulus to response is your 500 milliseconds, your half of a second. And if you're stressed out, it could be 2/3 of that. But there's 2 parts. There's a 250 millisecond that happens between the stimulus and the reaction, and there's another 250 milliseconds. And of course, this can go up and down depending if you're distracted or you're focused, etc. And there's another 250 milliseconds between the reaction and the response. And that's where choice comes into play. We have the opportunity to have choice, but in order to do that, we have to build conditioning in the stimulus reaction. Otherwise, we keep repeating the same thing. If you ride motorcycles or do some kind of sport, you may think of this as survival reaction. And if you don't train this on purpose, this is part of the breaking down in Ranger training and special ops. I literally feel like they break down your stimulus reaction so it doesn't really work anymore. You don't get triggered into fight or flight, which makes sense because fight or flight is designed the way we are built, 200,000-year-old brain, for dealing with a tiger, face to face with a tiger. Now, there are people in the world today that have those kinds of threats on a regular basis. It's very unfortunate. But for most of us, we don't have tiger-level threats in a lifetime, let alone every month or every year. So it makes sense that we do something to interrupt that fight or flight, and that's what we do with this. There's an exercise that we do to neutralize that, because the subconscious is biased towards looking for danger and peril, and so it's already primed to trigger that. We have to unprime that, number one, but we also change the reaction. There's a process beyond the scope of today. By the way, I'm doing a workshop on the 28th, and we will spend 90 minutes just on this part of it, because it's so important. If you don't have this, you can't have agency. If you don't have agency, you're one thought away potentially from an anxiety spiral. So we've got to get agency and get that all back under control. And then from response to emotions, you can have these, again, this is in milliseconds. So this whole thing, and I'll put action, is step 6. This whole thing can be easily under 2 minutes. And it's usually happening measured in seconds. It's just that when there's an emotional situation that occurs, if there's a emotional hit, somebody's potentially being triggered, emotionally hijacked or whatever, we need about 90 seconds to modulate that. So without the emotional piece, this is a second. We can get through this in a second and a half. We're having this, and it's happening all the time, which is how you get the 33,000 decisions per day. And then the last one is C for consciousness. This is step 7. And the consciousness is getting back to having this state, right? Having a pre-stimulus, a productive state, so we're not being already primed for fear and anxiety. And then we're ready for that next stimulus response. This is why people talk about rituals, having a ritual, because they want to set themselves up to win during the day. And we also cover, I use rituals, we use meditation, but the first thing we want to do is condition this so you're not having to rely on meditation. Nothing against meditation, but there are some people who aren't interested in doing it. Maybe they, it's interesting, when people hit rock bottom, it's like all of a sudden meditation becomes important. You don't have to meditate to get this. Meditation will help. You don't have to have rituals to get this. Rituals will help because we condition it in. Now, I will say this. I can condition this in. You will become aware of it. You will have the opportunity to go through the door. You'll spot the door. Let's talk about it like cognitive bias, planning fallacy. Planning fallacy says that the majority of the time we're planning something, especially in the near term, we're going to overestimate the simplicity of it. We're going to miscue on how quickly and how much we can get done, and we're going to be wrong we're going to just be wrong on the low side. We're not going to get it done. And planning fallacy, when they do this research, it shows up over and over. People will double down and double, even if they miss 3 weeks in a row hitting their targets, like in research, in these double-blind experiments, etc., they'll still double down that the fourth week is going to be different. So you can become aware that, hey, I'm stepping into planning fallacy. I'm falling into this trap. But you still have to go through the door. That's here. That's this response to action. You still have to take the action. I can't do that for you. We can condition it in so you're more likely to take it. But if you don't take it, if you want to go back and revisit the past, you have the choice to do that. What we're doing here is giving you the tools so that if you really want what's on the other side, that you have more than enough opportunities to step through that door. And that's the objective. So we start with purpose because purpose is enough juice that people will want to do this. I'm going to leave it there, and then next time I'll do this probably earlier next week. We'll do a part 2, and I'll get into the neuroscience of it, why this works. Not so much, we won't spend a lot of time on here, but we'll spend more time on the development plans, why it's so important, and I'll set it up with this. You may remember this, like going to college, it's most people remember this happening. In college, let's say it's a semester, so you only have 3 months, but there's like this window of time where if you have an opportunity in this window to either build a pattern of increase or fall down the path of decrease to a lower plateau. And I would say in the college class, it might be 2 or 3 weeks, but I would say in business, which is what we're talking about, this is about 90 days. Now, if you do research, you can find 60 days to 120 days. I would say there's another period out here that's about 30 days. So that would be 0 minus 30, or, T minus 30. So they start here. T minus 30 would be 30 days before. And the way I would frame that is you probably have your final interviews. You're maybe communicating with them. They're getting drug testing and there's communications going on. You have an opportunity to raise the bar and raise the expectations of what they're going to get and what's going to be expected of them. Not in a bad way, not in a gotcha way, but you're just clarifying some things because now they're getting closer and closer onto the team. And what's happening is people have more dopamine during this period, and dopamine is an amplifier of the neural pathway signal. So when we start building habits, neural pathways are involved, and this dopamine is an amplifier as well as the habit formation neurotransmitter. And we want to structure our first 90 days and structure the first 90 days of the people on our team so that we get something that looks more like this. And I would say then you keep the 2-year plan going, and that 2-year plan will be in 6 months increments. We'll talk about that in the third one. We'll get into more of the design of the plan, but next week we're going to talk about the neuroscience behind this. And it's one of those things, again, once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is what the military uses. This is how we get soldiers up and running and operational in weeks. This is how martial arts works, right? You get the people learning and you break them down and then you build them up, and they're constantly growing. For 2 years, they're engaged. They're going back to the school. They're spending money and they're getting belts. That's this 2-year plan, and we can structure that for your business. And that's what the next 2 weeks will be about. See you then.